the house at the end of Hollow Street. I had been a delivery driver for about 2 years, and I thought I had seen it all. People answer the door in their pajamas, scream at you for being late, or even forget they ordered anything at all. But that night, no amount of experience could have prepared me for what happened at the house at the end of Hollow Street. It was a Thursday night, and I was working the late shift, hoping to make a few extra bucks before calling it a night. Things had been slow, only a few small orders trickled in every now and then, the kind of boring, uneventful night where time seems to drag. My phone buzzed, alerting me to a new order. I glanced down at the screen. 1448 Hollow Street. My stomach sank a little. Hollow Street was a place people like to joke about. Not just a little creepy, but full of ghost stories. The kind of place you'd drive past and quicken your pace, locking your doors and looking straight ahead until it was out of sight. People used to say that the house at the very end of the street had been abandoned for years, left to rot. No one had lived there for as long as anyone could remember, and some said no one should. People said the place was haunted, but I figured that was just local gossip. Still, the order was real, and money was money. I pulled up the address on my GPS, half hoping it would fail to load, but it guided me straight to the dead end of Hollow Street, just like it would for any other order. The road was eerily quiet, as if the world had gone to sleep except for me. The few streetlights still functioning flickered weakly, casting a sickly pale light on the pavement. The deeper I drove into Hollow Street, the more those flickers seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat, like a warning telling me to turn back. I parked my car in front of the house at the very end, 1448 Hollow Street. The house was ordinary, yet unsettling. 2 stories, a wraparound porch with faded white paint, and a dilapidated mailbox. The porch light was on, casting a dim yellow glow, but the house itself felt like it was swallowing the light rather than reflecting it. The air was dense, thick with something I couldn't quite place. It felt like the weight of a nightmare pressing down on me. I considered just leaving the food on the porch and driving away, but the instructions were specific. Deliver to 1448 Hollow Street, knock 3 times. I grabbed the bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. As soon as my feet hit the ground, a chill ran down my spine. The wind carried the faint scent of decay, like something had been left to rot in the woods beyond the house. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves. This was nothing. I'd knock, drop the food, and leave. Simple. The walk up the cracked stone path leading to the porch felt like it took an eternity. My footsteps were louder than they should have been, each step echoing in the silence around me. I glanced around, hoping to see some sign of life, but the houses surrounding 1448 were dark, empty shells, their windows like black eyes watching me. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the wood. The paint on the door was cracked and peeling, as if no one had touched it in years. Something inside me screamed not to do it, but I ignored that instinct. My job was to knock. 3 knocks. That's all they asked for. I rapped my knuckles against the door, each knock sounding louder than the last in the oppressive stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. I waited, staring at the door, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. The silence was unnerving, and then I heard it, a voice from inside, faint but unmistakable. "Come in." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, and something about it sent a shiver racing down my spine. There was no reason to go inside. In fact, I knew that no delivery ever required entering the customer's home. I wasn't supposed to, and yet my feet didn't move away. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something like, "I'll leave it here." But before I could, the door creaked open. Just a crack, enough for me to see inside. The hallway beyond the door was dark, too dark for the dim light from the porch to reach. I felt that cold sensation again, the one that crawls up your neck and leaves your skin prickling. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run, I stepped forward, one foot slipping over the threshold. The door closed behind me with a soft click, as if sealing my fate. I stood in near total darkness. The only light came from the thin slivers that peeked through the door's windows, casting faint shadows on the floor. I squinted, trying to make out my surroundings. To my right, a narrow staircase ascended into darkness, and straight ahead, A long, narrow hallway stretched further into the house. Everything smelled old, musty, as if the house hadn't been opened in years. And yet, there was also that persistent odor of rot, like something foul was hidden just out of sight. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello? I have your delivery." My voice echoed strangely in the hallway, bouncing off the walls in ways that made me feel even more alone. I waited, listening to the silence. There was no sound of footsteps, no creak of floorboards, just that same heavy, suffocating quiet. "Come in," the voice said again, clearer this time but still soft, coming from deeper inside the house. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to go any further, but it felt like something was pulling me deeper into the house. I took a few hesitant steps down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't understand how the house could be this long from the outside, but logic had left me the moment I stepped through the door. I passed by doorways leading into empty, dark rooms, the shadows inside so thick they felt alive. The further I walked, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the dim light. The smell of decay grew stronger the deeper I went, turning my stomach. I had the urge to cover my nose, but I kept walking, as if in a trance. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, quickening with every step. Eventually, I reached the end of the hallway, where a doorway led into what appeared to be a dining room. Dim light spilled out from a single lamp, casting long shadows across the floor. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether I should go inside. Then I saw it. The dining table was set, plates arranged neatly as if for a dinner party, but the food had long since decayed. Mold covered the bread, and the meat had rotted away to a blackened mass. Worse than that were the figures sitting around the table. At first glance, I thought they were mannequins. Their skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over gaunt faces. Their clothes were old, outdated, and covered in dust. Their eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, glassy and lifeless. The smell was overpowering now, the stench of rotting flesh mingling with the damp air. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to turn around, walk out, and never look back. But before I could move, one of the figures twitched. The sound of its neck creaking as it turned to face me was like nails on a chalkboard. Slowly, unnaturally, the figure's hollow eyes locked onto mine. A shudder ran through me as the other figures began to move as well, their joints popping and cracking as they twisted in their chairs to look at me. I took another step back, my legs trembling. My breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted for the hallway, but as I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, shuffling, but unmistakable. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the figures rising from their chairs, their movements jerky, like puppets on invisible strings. Their mouths hung open, dry and cracked as they began to follow me. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps pounding on the floorboards. The walls seemed to close in around me, the house warping and twisting as if it were alive. The door at the end of the hall was farther than it should have been, as though the house was stretching itself, trapping me inside. I could hear the figures behind me, their shuffling footsteps growing closer. My hands fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. I slammed my shoulder against the door, panic surging through me. I could feel them behind me, their cold, decaying breath on the back of my neck. Finally, with a loud crack, the door gave way, and I stumbled outside, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and tore down the street without looking back. I never took another order from Hollow Street again.
The wrong address. It was late in the evening, and I was about ready to call it a night when my phone buzzed with a new order. I was tired, my muscles ached from being in the car all day, but I needed the extra cash. I glanced at the screen and saw the address, 1456 Black Hollow Road. I frowned. Black Hollow Road wasn't a place people usually ordered from, let alone this late. It was way out in the boonies, barely lit, and surrounded by dense woods. the kind of road that no one drove down unless they had a damn good reason. I hesitated, but the order was worth a good tip, and besides, I'd delivered to sketchy places before. This was just another in a long list. After plugging the address into my GPS, I realized it wasn't just deep in the woods. It was practically at the edge of town, on the outskirts where no one really lived anymore. The thought made me uneasy, but I shook it off. Superstition had no place in a job like this. I started driving, the familiar hum of my car engine doing little to soothe the rising tension in my chest. As I turned off the main road and onto the narrow, dirt-packed lane of Black Hollow Road, the streetlights disappeared. I was left to rely on my headlights, which cut through the trees like thin blades of light. The road was winding, the dense woods closing in on both sides, and the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I tried to push the feeling away. It was just another delivery, nothing special. Just drop off the food, grab the tip, and head home. But as I drove, something felt wrong. The GPS told me I was nearing the address, but all I could see was darkness, the woods getting thicker, the road more uneven with each bump. My headlights flickered across twisted trees that seemed to loom closer, branches clawing toward the car like fingers trying to pull me into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows between the trees. Every time I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement, a flash of pale skin, a glint of eyes. But when I looked again, there was nothing. The road narrowed and my GPS cheerfully announced, "You've arrived at your destination." I slowed the car, looking around in confusion. There was no house, no cabin, no mailbox, not even a driveway. Just more trees and the winding road continuing ahead into the blackness. I double-checked the address on my phone. 1456 Black Hollow Road. The coordinates were right, but there was nothing here. My heart began to pound in my chest, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. I rolled down my window, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, but all I heard was the rustling of leaves and the soft whisper of the wind. I shivered. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have turned around right then. I should have said screw the order and driven away. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I parked the car on the side of the road and grabbed the food from the passenger seat. Maybe the house was set back in the woods. I'd seen places like that before. Old cabins hidden away from the main road, accessible only by foot. I clicked on my phone's flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The moment my feet hit the dirt road, I felt it, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of creatures in the bushes, nothing. Just silence. I started walking toward where I thought the house might be, my flashlight flickering through the trees. As I moved deeper into the woods, the darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing the weak beam of light. My breath felt heavy in my chest, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the dead leaves and dirt beneath me. And then I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Relief flooded through me. There had to be a house up ahead, some kind of light source. Maybe it was just set further back than I expected. I continued forward, my heart racing, but the further I went, the more that glow felt wrong. It wasn't a steady light like a porch or a lamp. It was flickering, dimming, and brightening in irregular bursts. And the closer I got, the more I realized something was very, very wrong. As I broke through the tree line, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. There was a cabin, but it wasn't the kind of cozy, run-down shack I'd expected. No, this place looked ancient. The wood was blackened with rot, the windows covered in grime and dirt. The light I had seen was coming from inside, a sickly, greenish glow that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. I froze. Everything in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the safety of my car and leave. But something else, something darker, urged me forward. I stepped closer, feeling the weight of the air thicken around me. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't stop myself. As I reached the front of the cabin, I noticed something strange. There was no doorbell, no knocker, not even a doorknob. Just an old, splintering wooden door with deep, jagged scratches gouged into the surface, as though something had tried to claw its way out. I swallowed hard and knocked, more out of habit than anything else. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for some sign of life. Seconds passed, then minutes, and still nothing. No movement from inside, no voices, nothing. But just as I was about to turn around and leave, the door creaked open. It swung inward slowly, the old wood groaning in protest. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the inky blackness beyond. I took a tentative step forward, leaning in to get a better look. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile against the oppressive silence. There was no response, just the faint hum of that strange, pulsing light. I couldn't see anyone inside, no movement, no shadows, nothing. Just that eerie glow, flickering from somewhere deeper within the cabin. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was colder, damper, like I had just stepped into a tomb. The smell hit me next, musty and rotten, like something had been left to decay for years. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying to keep the stench at bay, but it was overwhelming. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die. I shook it, the light sputtering back to life just long enough to illuminate the room in front of me. That's when I saw them. Sitting at a long, decrepit dining table were figures, at least 6 of them. At first, I thought they were mannequins or statues, their faces too still, too pale to be human. But as I stepped closer, my stomach lurched. They weren't mannequins, they were people. Their skin was gray, sagging against their bones, their eyes sunken and lifeless. They were dressed in old, tattered clothes, the kind that looked like they had been out of fashion for decades. And they weren't moving. They just sat there, slumped in their chairs, their heads tilted at odd angles as though they had simply died in place. I took a step back, my foot hitting something soft. I turned my light downward and saw the last thing I ever expected. There was a body on the floor, curled up in a fetal position, fresh. The skin hadn't grayed yet, the clothes still relatively clean. My stomach churned as I realized what I was seeing. The people at the table, they weren't mannequins. They had been alive once, and now so was this poor soul on the floor. A loud creak echoed through the cabin, and my heart jumped into my throat. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the far corner of the room. The pulsing light was coming from there, casting a sickly glow on the walls. And standing just at the edge of the light, watching me, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its skin stretched tightly over its bones. It stared at me with hollow black eyes. The creature didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, weighing me down with a fear so primal it took everything in me not to scream. I dropped the food. I didn't even think. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears as I bolted for the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind me, its presence looming like a dark cloud, following me as I tore through the woods. Branches scratched at my face, my legs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I floored it, speeding down the narrow road without a second glance. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. the cabin and whatever haunted it far behind me. But I knew, deep down, that I hadn't really left it behind. The wrong address had found me, and it would find me again. If you're enjoying our content, don't hesitate to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your comments help us improve and reach more people just like you, so let us know what you think. And don't forget to share with friends who love a good scare. Together we can grow our community and keep bringing you the best horror stories.
The repeating delivery. Being a delivery driver isn't exactly the most exciting job. Most nights, you get the same routes, the same people, and the same routine. But sometimes, something strange happens. Something that sticks with you long after the shift is over. That's what happened to me with the house on Greenview Lane. It started off normal enough. I had just clocked into the evening shift, scrolling through my phone to kill some time between orders. The late shift could be slow, especially during the week. But just as I was about to get comfortable, my phone buzzed with a new order. It was from a place I hadn't seen before, 742 Greenview Lane. The address seemed odd. I'd been delivering in the area for almost a year, and I thought I knew all the neighborhoods, but Greenview Lane didn't ring a bell. Still, I plugged the address into the GPS and headed out. The drive was longer than I expected, winding through quiet residential streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns. The houses here looked more like estates, big old homes set back from the road with sprawling front yards, the kind of neighborhood where money had clearly been around for generations. As I pulled onto Greenview Lane, my GPS chirped, "Arrived at destination." I slowed down, scanning the house numbers. On my left, I saw the numbers counting up, but no sign of 742. The houses were well lit, well kept. But my GPS kept insisting I'd arrived. I drove further down the road, and the houses started to look different. The lawns weren't as well kept, the lights not as bright. Finally, near the end of the lane, I found it. 742 Greenview Lane. It was a house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the lawn looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It stood out from the other homes on the street like a decaying tooth among a row of perfect white ones. The windows were dark, no sign of life inside, and the porch light flickered weakly as if it were struggling to stay alive. The house gave off an aura that made my skin prickle. I sat in my car for a minute, gripping the steering wheel tightly, debating whether I should just cancel the order and leave. But I needed the money, and besides, it was just a house, nothing more. I grabbed the delivery bag from the passenger seat, double-checking the address on my phone. 742 Greenview Lane. It matched. As I walked up the cracked stone path to the front porch, the wind picked up, carrying a chill that seemed out of place for the season. The closer I got to the house, the stronger the feeling of unease became. Something about this place was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet night. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I shifted on my feet, glancing back at my car, half tempted to just leave the food on the porch and go. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from inside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, growing louder as they approached the door. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for whoever was inside to answer. The door creaked open just a crack, and I could barely make out a figure standing in the shadows. "Delivery for 742 Greenview Lane?" I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice wavered slightly. The figure didn't respond right away. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint sound of breathing from the other side of the door. Then a hand slipped through the crack, a pale, thin hand, and reached out to take the bag of food. The fingers looked wrong. They were long and bony, the skin stretched tight over the knuckles, like they belonged to someone far older than I had expected. "Thank you," a voice whispered from inside. barely audible. The door closed quickly after, with a sharp click, leaving me standing there in the cold night. I hurried back to my car, the sense of unease still clinging to me like a second skin. As soon as I got inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. The whole experience felt weird, but it was just one delivery, probably some old shut-in who didn't like interacting with people. I tried to shake it off as I headed back toward the restaurant. The rest of the night was uneventful, and by the time my shift ended, I had mostly forgotten about the strange house on Greenview Lane. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next night, around the same time, I got another order from 742 Greenview Lane. My stomach dropped when I saw the address, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Some customers ordered a lot, especially if they didn't get out much. Maybe they just liked the food. Still, as I drove back down that winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. The houses looked the same as they had the night before, pristine and well kept. But when I reached the end of the lane, the old house seemed darker, more foreboding. The flickering porch light was out now, leaving the front yard draped in shadow. I parked the car and stared at the house for a long time, debating whether I should cancel the order. But curiosity and the need for money won out again. I grabbed the bag and made my way to the front door, the sense of déjà vu hitting me hard. I knocked, and the same thing happened. The footsteps inside, the slow creaking of the door, the pale hand reaching out from the darkness. This time, though, I noticed something else. When the door cracked open, a cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, rotting smell. I handed over the food quickly, trying to ignore the sick feeling growing in my gut. "Thank you," the voice whispered again, the door closing just as fast as the night before. I left without saying another word. I couldn't stop thinking about it that night. Something was wrong with that house. The way it felt, the way it smelled, the way the figure inside never fully revealed themselves. I was determined not to think about it too much, but it gnawed at the back of my mind, lingering like the faint scent of rot that had come from inside. I told myself it was none of my business. Just another delivery, right? Still, that house on Greenview Lane haunted me long after my shift ended. The next day I made a promise to myself. If I got another order from 742 Greenview Lane, I'd reject it. Simple as that. I didn't need that kind of weirdness in my life, but when my phone buzzed that evening with a new order, I felt a chill run through me before I even looked at the screen. Sure enough, 742 Greenview Lane. My heart raced as I stared at the notification, my thumb hovering over the reject button. But something stopped me, a nagging thought, a dark curiosity that I couldn't shake. I knew it was a bad idea, but I also knew I couldn't resist. I needed to know what was going on in that house, so, against my better judgment, I accepted the order. The drive was the same, but everything felt heavier this time. The trees lining the road seemed to bend in closer, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers. The sky was darker, the streetlights dimmer, and when I finally reached the house, the air felt wrong, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. I parked in front of the house, but this time I didn't get out right away. I sat there, staring at the dilapidated building, trying to summon the courage to walk up to the door again. The porch light, still out from the night before, left the house in total darkness. I could barely make out the door in the faint glow of my headlights. With a deep breath, I grabbed the food and stepped out of the car. My legs felt heavier with each step I took, like the house itself was trying to pull me back. The wind was still, the air thick with the same unsettling quiet I had experienced the first time. My hand shook as I knocked on the door. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, but this time they sounded different. They were heavier, almost as if someone was dragging something along the floor. The door creaked open a fraction, and again that same pale hand appeared from the darkness. "Thank you," the voice whispered, but there was something different in the tone this time. It wasn't a polite murmur. It sounded desperate, hungry. I handed the food over quickly, but before the hand could pull it away, I found myself blurting out, "Is everything okay in there?" The hand froze, hovering in the air for a moment, before retracting slightly into the darkness. The door didn't close this time, just hung there, slightly ajar, as if the figure inside was considering my question. For a moment, there was no sound, but the faint rustling of dead leaves in the wind. Then, the voice spoke again, softer than before, but with a strange edge to it. "Please, help me." My blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit with what I'd experienced over the last 2 nights. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't equipped to deal with this. I was just a delivery driver. I started, but before I could finish, the door creaked open a little wider. The inside of the house was pitch black. My flashlight, the one I always carried in my car, was back in the cup holder. All I could see was a dark hallway stretching into the shadows. But what I felt, that was something else. The air coming from inside was ice cold, thick with the scent of rot and decay. And somewhere deeper in the house, beyond where I could see, I heard something moving. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like something scraping across the floor. Then it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like dragging footsteps, heavy and labored, coming closer. I stepped back again, instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't look away. Something was moving toward the door, something that didn't want me to see it, but was too slow to stay hidden forever. "Please," the voice whispered again, more urgent now, as if whatever was speaking was no longer at the door, but somewhere deeper inside. "Don't leave me." I should have run. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around, get in my car, and drive as far away from that place as possible. But instead, I found myself reaching for the door, pushing it open just a little wider. The wood groaned under my hand, and as I did, the dim glow from the outside barely illuminated the hallway. That's when I saw it. The figure standing at the end of the hallway wasn't human, not anymore at least. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched impossibly thin over its bones. Its face was gaunt, eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets. The thing was bent and twisted, its limbs too long, its body contorted in unnatural angles, as if it had been broken and then forced back together. But what truly terrified me were its eyes. They were wide and dark, filled with a kind of emptiness that swallowed the dim light. They were locked onto me, unblinking, hungry. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The figure took a step forward, dragging its leg behind it. The sound of its movements scraped against the floor like nails on a chalkboard, each step slow, deliberate, as if it knew I had nowhere to go. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, didn't care about the food or the money. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I slammed into my car, barely managing to unlock the door with trembling hands. As soon as I got in, I floored the gas, my tires screeching on the pavement as I sped away from the house. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the brightly lit parts of town. My hands were still shaking when I finally pulled over, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, replaying what I had seen over and over again, trying to make sense of it. But the truth was, there was no making sense of it. I called in sick the next day, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew the house wasn't done with me. The following night, I got the same order again, 742 Greenview Lane. This time, I rejected it. But as I stared at the screen, watching the notification disappear, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be the last time. I knew, somehow I knew, that the house would come for me again. It was waiting, biding its time, drawing me closer with each passing night. I didn't drive down Greenview Lane again after that. But even now, I still see the house in my nightmares. And in the darkness, I hear the slow, dragging footsteps of whatever was waiting inside, calling my name.
The shadow in the alley. I never thought that something as mundane as delivering food could leave me shaken to the core, but then again, most people don't expect to be haunted by a shadow. It was a Friday night, and as usual, I was hustling through my deliveries. The city was buzzing, clubs and bars overflowing with people, cars honking, and groups of friends stumbling through the streets with laughter echoing into the night. The chaos of it all used to get on my nerves when I first started this job, but now it was just background noise. A normal night. Or so I thought. I was about halfway through my shift when I got an order to deliver to an apartment building on the other side of town, down near the Old District. The Old District was an odd place, full of narrow streets and even narrower alleys, a maze of brick buildings that hadn't seen a renovation in decades. During the day, it was full of quirky little shops and hidden cafes, but at night, the place took on a different character. As I drove there, the streets grew quieter, the usual buzz of the city slowly fading away behind me. The streetlights became fewer and further between, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. I glanced at the delivery address again, 1249 Westford Lane. I'd been there once or twice before. The building was tucked away down a small alley, one of those places that always gave me the creeps. It wasn't run down, exactly, but something about it felt wrong. It always had. I pulled up to the edge of the alley, parked my car and grabbed the food. The alley was dark, barely lit by a single flickering bulb above a rusted metal door. The narrow space between the buildings seemed to swallow sound, making the city's distant hum feel miles away. I shrugged off the eerie sensation creeping up my spine. It was just an alley. No big deal. I'd done this 1,000 times. I made my way down the alley, my footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The air was colder here, the wind funneled between the buildings, and the faint smell of damp concrete clung to the air. I had my jacket zipped up, but the chill still cut through me, making my skin prickle. I reached the door to the apartment complex and knocked, waiting for someone to buzz me in. After a moment, the familiar buzz of the door unlocking echoed down the alley, and I slipped inside. The building was as old as I remembered, dingy walls, cracked tiles, and a faint smell of mildew in the air. The customer had ordered from one of the higher floors, so I took the elevator up. It creaked and groaned as it ascended, each jolt sending a nervous flutter through my chest. When I finally reached the door, a young woman opened it and greeted me with a tired smile. I handed over the food, she paid, and that was that. An easy delivery, no problems. But it wasn't until I left the building that things started to get strange. I stepped back into the alley, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it had become. The flickering light above the door was out now, and the shadows seemed to have deepened, stretching longer than they should have. I shivered, glancing around, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the alley, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the street, there was a shadow. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a stray cat or something. But it wasn't. The shadow was wrong. It didn't move like a person or an animal. It was too still, too dark. I squinted, trying to make out the shape, but the longer I stared, the more I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just a shadow. It was watching me. I felt it. The way you feel someone's eyes on you when you're being stared at. My pulse quickened, my breath coming in shallow bursts. For a moment I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. But then the shadow shifted, just a little, but enough to send a wave of fear coursing through me. I turned and walked quickly toward my car, my footsteps echoing louder in the silence of the alley. I could feel the shadow behind me, moving. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored it, it would go away. When I finally reached my car, I threw open the door and jumped inside, locking it behind me with trembling hands. My heart was pounding in my chest. my skin slick with cold sweat. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breath. What the hell had I just seen? I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But even as I started the car and pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow following me, but the alley was empty. Still, the knot of dread in my stomach wouldn't go away. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the memory of that shadow lingered. I didn't tell anyone about it. Who would believe me? It was just a shadow after all. Nothing to be afraid of, or so I thought. The next night, things got worse. I was back on my delivery shift, and I hadn't stopped thinking about what I'd seen in that alley. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I avoided looking at dark alleys, avoided delivering in that part of town, but part of me knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Sure enough, near the end of my shift, I got another order. 1249 Westford Lane. My heart sank. I stared at the address on my screen, my finger hovering over the reject button. I could cancel the order, make up some excuse. But then I'd lose out on the money, and I couldn't afford that. So, reluctantly, I accepted the delivery. The drive to the old district was quieter than usual. The streets were nearly deserted, the lights dimmer than I remembered. The weight of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket, but I forced myself to focus on the task. It was just a delivery. Get in, drop off the food, get out. Simple. When I reached the alley, I parked in the same spot as before, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The alley looked darker this time, the shadows thicker. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the car, to turn around and leave. But I didn't. I grabbed the food and stepped out of the car, forcing myself to walk toward the building. My footsteps sounded too loud in the silence, and with each step, I felt that same sense of being watched creeping up my spine. I glanced around, my eyes darting from one dark corner to another, but there was nothing there. Not yet, anyway. I delivered the food without incident, the customer giving me the same tired smile as before. But as I turned to leave, I hesitated. I didn't want to go back into that alley. The memory of the shadow loomed large in my mind, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I stood at the entrance of the alley for what felt like an eternity, staring into the darkness. My car was only a few yards away, but the space between me and it felt like miles. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The shadow. It was back, standing at the far end of the alley, darker and more distinct than before. It wasn't just a trick of the light this time. I was sure of it. The shadow was human-shaped now, tall and looming, its edges flickering like it wasn't fully solid. And it was watching me. My throat tightened, fear freezing me in place. The shadow didn't move, but I felt its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. I could feel it pulling me toward it, like some invisible force was trying to draw me closer. My legs felt weak, my hands shaking as I clutched the delivery bag to my chest. Run! My mind screamed at me, but my body refused to obey. The shadow shifted again, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. It moved unnaturally, like a puppet on strings, its form flickering in and out of the darkness. The closer it came, the heavier the air around me became, as though the very atmosphere was thickening with malevolent energy. Finally, I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted toward my car. I didn't care how stupid I looked. I didn't care if anyone saw me. I just needed to get away. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands shook so badly I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine. As I reversed out of the alley, I glanced back one last time. The shadow was gone. I drove away as fast as I could, my heart racing, the fear still coursing through my veins. But as I sped through the empty streets, something told me that I wasn't truly free. That shadow, whatever it was hadn't just been confined to that alley. It was following me. For the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I saw the shadow everywhere, lurking in the corners of my vision, flickering in darkened windows as I passed by, appearing in every alley I had to walk through. Each time it grew clearer, more defined, and each time I felt its presence more strongly, like it was closing in on me. I stopped taking late-night deliveries. I avoided the old district entirely, but it didn't matter. The shadow was always there, waiting for me, watching. It wanted something from me. I don't know what, but I could feel its hunger, its need, growing stronger with each passing night. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't outrun it forever.
The silent order. The late shift was always the worst. It wasn't the hours that bothered me, it was the eerie silence. Most of the time, I didn't mind the quiet. No honking horns, no endless chatter from customers, no rush hour chaos. But on nights like tonight, when the air seemed to thicken with tension, every minute dragged, and every shadow looked just a little darker than usual. It had been a slow evening, with only a few scattered deliveries keeping me busy. I was about ready to call it a night when my phone buzzed with a new order. I glanced at the screen, and a frown immediately formed on my face. There was no name on the order, no specific address either. Just GPS coordinates and a short note. Enter through the side gate. I blinked. That was unusual. Normally, customers would at least leave an apartment number or a name, but this? It felt more like a message you'd see in a spy movie or a mystery novel. But my curiosity outweighed my discomfort. The coordinates weren't far from my location and it was getting late, so I figured I'd knock this one out and head home. I plugged the coordinates into my GPS, grabbed the food from the counter, and headed to my car. The streets were quieter than usual, a thin fog rolling in from the river, making everything seem even more surreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I kept driving, telling myself it was just another strange customer. As I followed the directions, the buildings around me grew older, more dilapidated. The bright streetlights faded into dim, flickering bulbs, casting long, distorted shadows on the empty sidewalks. The GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of town, a neighborhood that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Finally, the coordinates led me to an old Gothic-style mansion sitting at the end of a narrow cobblestone street. The place was massive, with tall iron gates that were slightly ajar and ivy crawling up the stone walls like it was trying to swallow the house whole. The windows were dark, and no lights were on inside. The mansion gave off an air of abandonment, yet it didn't look run down, just empty, forgotten. I parked my car outside the gates, hesitating for a moment. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around, to cancel the order, and leave. But there was that note. Enter through the side gate. I'd seen worse instructions, but this one felt different. Stranger, more ominous. I grabbed the food, took a deep breath, and walked toward the side gate, which was hidden between thick, overgrown bushes. The gate was unlocked, just like the note had promised, and I stepped through into a narrow pathway that wrapped around the mansion. The air was colder here, and the wind whistled softly through the trees, making the overgrown branches sway like skeletal hands. I made my way down the path, the gravel crunching under my feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The path led to a large wooden door at the back of the mansion, covered in peeling paint and overgrown vines. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, yet there was something distinctly unsettling about how it loomed in front of me, as if it had been waiting for me. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The silence was thick, pressing in from all sides. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for someone, anyone, to open the door. When no one came, I knocked again, louder this time, my knuckles rapping against the heavy wood. Still nothing. I glanced around, half expecting someone to pop out of the shadows. But the night was still, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I was just about to turn back, figuring this was a prank, when I heard it, the faintest creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. I turned around, and sure enough, the wooden door had cracked open just a bit, revealing darkness beyond. My heart skipped a beat, but I shook off the creeping dread that was trying to take hold. Someone had to be inside. They were probably just being weird or cautious. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the night air. "I've got your food." No response. The door remained slightly ajar, inviting me in. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave. But I had come this far. I couldn't just leave the food at the door and walk away. That wouldn't look good on my record. So, against my better judgment, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The air inside was cold, musty, and thick with dust, like the place hadn't been lived in for years. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but I could just make out the vague shapes of furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in place. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped further into the house, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. "Hello," I called out again, my voice shaky now. "Your food is here." Still no answer. I took a few more steps, my heart racing in my chest. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. The house was too quiet, too still, like the very air was holding its breath. I glanced around, trying to make sense of the place. The furniture, the old paintings on the walls, the thick, dusty drapes. It all looked like something out of a different time. Like a place frozen in the past, untouched by the world outside. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, there was a door. A smaller, older door, half hidden by the shadows. It was slightly ajar, just like the front door, as if it had been left open on purpose. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like some invisible force was pulling me toward it. I walked over to the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The wood was cold, rough under my fingertips. I hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, I pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The room beyond was small and cramped, the walls lined with strange symbols and markings that I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a single candle, burning with a weak, flickering flame. Around the table were several figures, cloaked in long, dark robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just sat there, perfectly still, as if they had been waiting for me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of ritual, a cult, a prank? I had no idea. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, fast. But before I could move, one of the figures spoke. "You've brought the offering." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it echoed in the small room like a thunderclap. My heart pounded in my chest, panic rising in my throat. I just have your food," I stammered, my voice barely audible. The figure closest to me slowly turned their head, their hood shifting just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something underneath, something pale, gaunt, and wrong. "You are the offering." My blood turned to ice. Without thinking, I dropped the food and bolted. I didn't care about politeness or protocols anymore. I needed to get out of that house. I sprinted back through the darkened hall, my footsteps pounding against the floor, the shadows closing in around me. I could feel them behind me, those cloaked figures, moving silently, but I didn't dare look back. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I didn't look back. I never delivered to that part of town again. I didn't care what it cost me. I'd heard rumors about the old district, stories of strange cults and forgotten houses. but I never believed them. Not until that night. Even now, I still see their faces in my nightmares. Pale, gaunt, and waiting. Always waiting. And I know, deep down, that I was lucky. Lucky that I got away. Lucky that I wasn't the offering that night. But I also know this. They'll keep waiting. And one day, someone won't be so lucky.
The Dollhouse. It was a hot, sticky summer evening when I got the order that would change everything. I had been driving for hours, drenched in sweat from the heat that had settled over the city like a suffocating blanket. It was one of those nights when all I wanted to do was finish my shift, get home, and take a cold shower. But of course, the universe had other plans. The order came in just as I was about to call it a night. I was already halfway to my place when the notification pinged on my phone. My gut told me to ignore it, but money's money and I was trying to save up for a vacation. Something to break up the monotony of everyday life. With a sigh, I opened the app and checked the address. 395 Pinehurst Avenue. It wasn't an area I was familiar with, but it was on the other side of town, deep in a neighborhood I had never been to before. The name didn't ring any bells, but the tip was good, so I accepted the order and turned the car around, heading toward the distant edge of the city. As I drove, the roads began to narrow, and the houses grew farther apart, shrouded in darkness. Pinehurst Avenue wasn't in a bad part of town, but it wasn't well lit either. It had a quiet, forgotten feeling to it, like the kind of place where nothing happened, or if it did, no one would be around to notice. The GPS guided me to a large, old Victorian-style house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The place looked massive, its intricate woodwork and turrets rising against the dark sky. The house might have been beautiful once, but now it looked weathered, the paint chipped and peeling, the windows dark. Even in the low light, I could see that the lawn was overgrown, weeds creeping up the sides of the house like it was being reclaimed by nature. Something about the house made me pause. It felt off. Maybe it was the way it loomed over the other houses on the street, or the fact that every window seemed like a pair of dark, watching eyes. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house, nothing more. I parked the car in front of the house, grabbed the food from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the thick, humid night. The air felt heavier here, almost like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I took a deep breath and walked up the stone path that led to the front door. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was no doorbell, just a small brass knocker shaped like a hand. I hesitated for a moment before reaching up and giving the knocker a couple of taps. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, but not all the way. Just a sliver, enough for me to see part of a face peeking through the crack. It was a woman, probably in her late 40s or early 50s, her skin pale and drawn tight over sharp features. Her eyes were shadowed, like she hadn't slept in days, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. "Delivery for Pinehurst?" I said, holding up the bag. She didn't respond right away, just stared at me with those tired, sunken eyes. After a long moment, she nodded and opened the door wider. I handed her the food, but instead of taking it, she stepped back, leaving the door wide open behind her. "Could you bring it inside?" she asked, her voice soft but strained. I hesitated. It wasn't normal for customers to ask us inside, and frankly, I wasn't comfortable with it. But something about the way she looked, the hollow desperation in her eyes, made me nod and follow her in. The inside of the house was as old as the outside, but much better preserved. The floors were made of polished hardwood, the walls lined with dark, expensive-looking wood paneling. Antique furniture filled the space, couches, chairs, and side tables that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The air smelled faintly of dust and lavender, with an underlying scent that I couldn't quite place. She led me into a small sitting room off to the side of the foyer, where a low coffee table stood in front of an ornate fireplace. The woman gestured to the table, and I set the food down. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave, but then paused, as if she wanted to say something else. I waited, unsure of whether I should leave or stay. But then, without another word, she walked out of the room, disappearing down a long hallway that stretched deeper into the house. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I looked around the sitting room, I saw them. Dolls, dozens of them, sitting on shelves and chairs propped up against walls and displayed in glass cases. They were everywhere, their lifeless glass eyes staring blankly at nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized how many there were. Big dolls, small dolls, porcelain dolls, and rag dolls. Some were dressed in fancy, old-fashioned clothes, others in tattered, faded outfits. But they all had one thing in common. Each of them was eerily lifelike. Too lifelike. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't a fan of dolls, but these were different. There was something unsettling about the way they were posed, like they were frozen in mid-motion. One doll sat on a small chair, its head slightly tilted as if it were listening. Another stood near the window, its hand raised as if it were waving. And then my eyes landed on the largest doll in the room. It stood in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. Unlike the others, this doll was life-sized, dressed in a flowing white gown that looked like something out of the Victorian era. Its face was pale, almost ghostly, with delicate features and long, dark hair that cascaded down its shoulders. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized it looked familiar, too familiar. My stomach dropped as I took a step closer, squinting to get a better look. The doll's face. It was identical to the woman who had just left the room. The same sharp features, the same hollow eyes, the same pale skin. What the hell? I muttered under my breath. A sudden creak behind me made me spin around. The door to the hallway was slightly ajar, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching again. I quickly backed away from the doll, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of there. Now. I turned and hurried toward the front door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice, soft, distant, and echoing through the house. "Don't go." I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife, sending a wave of cold dread through me. "Stay." It was the woman's voice, but it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the room behind me, from the dolls. I swallowed hard, my hand shaking as I gripped the doorknob. Every instinct told me to leave, to get the hell out of that house, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly I turned around, my eyes scanning the room full of dolls. They hadn't moved, but something was different. The air felt heavier now, the room darker. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room, like something was hiding just out of sight, watching. "Stay with us," the voice whispered again. This time I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The dolls were watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I backed up against the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My heart raced in my chest and I felt a bead of sweat roll down my forehead. I needed to get out, but my body refused to move. My legs felt like lead, my arms heavy as if something was holding me in place. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the life-sized doll. It was moving, Slowly, deliberately, it stepped out of the shadows, its glassy eyes locked onto mine. The gown it wore rustled softly as it moved, its joints creaking with every step. "Stay with us," it whispered again, its voice a perfect imitation of the woman's. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare as the doll continued to move toward me, its face expressionless, its eyes empty. Finally, something inside me snapped. I reached for the doorknob, twisted it, and yanked the door open. Without looking back, I bolted out of the house and into the night, my footsteps pounding on the stone path as I raced to my car. I didn't stop running until I was behind the wheel, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I floored the gas and sped away, my heart still hammering in my chest. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the dolls standing at the edge of the driveway, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I didn't take any more deliveries that night. In fact, I never took another order to that part of town again. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, the dolls, was still watching me, waiting for me to come back. And every time I pass by that street now, I make sure to look the other way.
The missing tip. Everyone in the delivery business knows there are two kinds of customers: the ones who appreciate your effort and the ones who make you regret ever taking the job. Most of the time, I can handle the rude ones. They come and go, and their complaints slide off me like water off a duck's back. But there's always that one customer who sticks in your mind, the one who's just bad enough that you start avoiding their address, even if it costs you some money. For me, that customer was Mr. Beckett. He lived in one of those massive, modern mansions on the edge of town, the kind where every window seemed to gleam like it had been polished for hours. The house looked more like a fortress than a home, all clean lines and sharp angles, surrounded by manicured hedges and a long, winding driveway. It screamed money, the kind of money that should come with generous tips. But Mr. Beckett was notorious for being stingy. I had delivered to his place a handful of times before, and not once had I gotten so much as a thank you. He'd take the food, grunt, and shut the door. No tip, no conversation, nothing. To make matters worse, he had this smug, superior attitude, like he couldn't be bothered to acknowledge the person delivering his food. The guy rubbed me the wrong way, but what could I do? It was part of the job. That night, it had been a long shift, and I was ready to go home when my phone buzzed with another order. Of course, it was for Mr. Beckett. I sighed, staring at the screen, debating whether to take it or not. The money was decent, but the idea of dealing with him again after a long day was soul-crushing. My exhaustion won out over my irritation, and I reluctantly accepted the order. The drive to Mr. Beckett's place was quiet, the streets almost deserted at this time of night. The city had fallen into that peaceful lull between the chaos of evening and the stillness of midnight, and the lights from my dashboard were the only thing keeping me company as I made my way toward the wealthy neighborhood on the outskirts of town. When I pulled up in front of Mr. Beckett's mansion, the familiar sense of dread settled over me. The house looked even more imposing in the dark, the clean, modern lines of the building illuminated by strategically placed spotlights along the driveway. It was the kind of house that seemed designed to intimidate, to make you feel small just by looking at it. I grabbed the delivery bag and walked up the long driveway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of gravel beneath my feet. As I reached the front door, I hesitated for a second, my hand poised to knock. I didn't know why, but something about the house felt different tonight. There was a heaviness in the air, a strange stillness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Shaking off the feeling, I knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. After a few moments, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened, and there stood Mr. Beckett, looking as disinterested as ever. His dark hair was slicked back, and he wore an expensive-looking robe that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He didn't say a word as I handed him the food. He simply took it, gave me a curt nod, and turned to close the door. That was when I snapped. I was exhausted, frustrated, and sick of dealing with rude customers like him. Without really thinking, I blurted out, "You know, a tip wouldn't kill you." The words hung in the air, heavier than I'd intended. For a second, I regretted saying anything. But Mr. Beckett paused, the door halfway closed, and turned to look at me. His cold, dark eyes narrowed, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, you'll get what's coming to you," he said, his voice low and dripping with malice. Then he shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, dumbfounded. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I shook my head, trying to brush off the encounter. I had enough problems without dealing with his cryptic threats. I turned and walked back to my car, feeling a strange sense of unease settle over me as I drove away from the mansion. Something about the way he had said those words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. But by the time I got home, I was too tired to care. I showered, ate, and collapsed into bed, trying to push Mr. Beckett's smug face out of my head. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was standing outside Mr. Beckett's mansion, but it wasn't the sleek modern house I had been to earlier. Instead, it was old, decaying, with broken windows and overgrown vines crawling up the walls. The once pristine lawn was wild and untamed, the driveway cracked and crumbling. In the dream, I knocked on the door, just like I had earlier that night. But when the door opened, there was no Mr. Beckett. Instead, the inside of the house was dark, so dark I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. And somewhere, deep within that darkness, I heard something moving, something slow, something wet. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that it took me a moment to remember where I was. I lay in bed for a while, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It clung to me, wrapping around my chest like a vice. The next day, I tried to put the dream out of my mind. It was just a dream, after all. But as my shift started, a nagging feeling of unease followed me around, making everything feel off. I couldn't concentrate, my mind constantly drifting back to the dream, to the sound of something moving in the dark. And then, near the end of my shift, my phone buzzed with a new order. It was Mr. Beckett. My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. I didn't want to go back to his house, not after what had happened the night before, not after that dream. But I couldn't afford to turn down orders. With a heavy sigh, I accepted the delivery and headed out to his mansion. As I drove, the city seemed quieter than usual. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the road. The air felt thick, like the atmosphere had changed somehow, becoming heavier and more oppressive. When I pulled up in front of Mr. Beckett's mansion, the feeling of unease deepened. The house looked the same as it had before, but something was different. It felt darker, like the shadows around the house were thicker, more menacing. I grabbed the food and walked up the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself that I was being ridiculous, that it was just another delivery. But as I reached the front door, that same sense of dread from the night before came rushing back. I knocked on the door, but this time, the door didn't open right away. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse quickening with each passing second. Finally, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from inside. The door creaked open, and there stood Mr. Beckett. But he looked different. His face was pale, his skin almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken, dark shadows lining his hollow cheeks. He didn't speak, didn't smirk like he had before. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty, lifeless eyes. "I've got your food," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't respond. He just kept staring at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a chill running down my spine. Finally, Mr. Beckett moved. He reached out and took the food from my hands, but instead of closing the door, he stepped back, opening it wider. "Come inside," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get the hell out of there. But something about the way he was looking at me, something about the dark, yawning space behind him, kept me rooted to the spot. I should get going, I stammered, taking a step back. Come inside, he repeated, his voice colder this time, more insistent. I swallowed hard, my heart racing in my chest. I took another step back, but before I could turn and leave, Mr. Beckett lunged forward, grabbing my arm with an iron grip. His fingers were icy cold, and his touch sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. "Let go of me!" I shouted, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened, his nails digging into my skin. "You asked for what's coming to you!" he hissed, his eyes gleaming with a sickening intensity. With one final yank, I broke free from his grasp and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet in my desperate attempt to get away. I turned and ran, sprinting down the driveway, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see Mr. Beckett standing in the doorway, but the door was closed. The mansion stood silent and still, bathed in the eerie glow of the outdoor lights. I drove away as fast as I could, my mind racing, my skin still tingling where he had grabbed me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to Mr. Beckett's house again.
The locked door. It was one of those long, endless shifts where the hours seemed to stretch on forever. The kind of night where you start questioning why you ever got into the delivery business in the first place. My back ached from being hunched over the wheel for so long, and my mind was drifting, thinking about all the things I could be doing instead of driving around town. I was about ready to call it quits when my phone buzzed with another order. I glanced at the screen and sighed. Another one from the upscale part of town, those huge, fancy houses that always seemed way too quiet for their size. The tip looked decent, so I figured I'd squeeze in one last delivery before heading home. The address was for a place I hadn't been to before, 865 Bramblewood Lane. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Still, an order was an order, so I punched it into my GPS and started driving. The neighborhood was far out, tucked away in a wooded area where the houses were spaced far apart, each one secluded behind tall iron gates or dense hedges. The drive itself was peaceful at first, the tree-lined roads winding through the dark like something out of a movie. But the further I drove, the more isolated it felt. The houses grew sparser, and the streetlights became fewer and dimmer, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. I finally pulled up to 865 Bramblewood Lane and stopped in front of a massive wrought-iron gate. Behind it stood one of the largest mansions I'd ever seen. It looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 19th century, tall, dark, and imposing, with ivy crawling up the stone walls and turrets that seemed to scrape the sky. The place was huge, way bigger than any normal family home. The kind of house that had to have at least 20 rooms, all of them dark and quiet. A mansion like that shouldn't be so still. It should be filled with life, bustling with people, or at least a few staff members. But this place, it was dead silent. The only movement came from the wind, rustling the trees that bordered the property. I pushed the buzzer on the gate, half expecting no one to answer. After a few long seconds, a crackling voice came through the intercom. "Yes?" The voice was deep and almost robotic, as if distorted through old, worn-out speakers. Delivery for 865 Bramblewood Lane," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, followed by a loud buzz as the gate slowly creaked open. I drove up the long, winding driveway, the tires of my car crunching against the gravel. The mansion loomed larger as I got closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving into something I shouldn't be. When I reached the front of the house, I parked and grabbed the food from the passenger seat. The front door was massive, made of dark wood with intricate carvings. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. I hesitated before knocking, my knuckles hovering over the wood. Something about this place felt off, like it didn't belong in this time. Finally, I knocked, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet night. After a few moments, the door creaked open just a crack, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. A man stood in the doorway, tall and thin, with greying hair slicked back and sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and he wore a suit that looked like it belonged in a different century, complete with a waistcoat and cravat. "Come in," he said, his voice low and gravelly. His eyes flicked to the bag of food in my hands, and then back to me. I hesitated. Normally I didn't go inside customers' houses. Most people just took their food at the door, and that was that. But something about the man's gaze made me feel like I didn't have a choice. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. A coldness that settled into my bones, far colder than the night air outside. The entryway was vast, with high ceilings and grand chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like forgotten relics. The floors were made of polished marble, the walls adorned with portraits of stern-looking figures who seemed to watch me as I walked past. "Set it down in the dining room," the man instructed, gesturing to a room just off the main hall. I walked into the dining room and immediately felt a wave of unease wash over me. The table was long, much longer than any normal dining table, and set for what looked like a feast. But the plates were empty, the silverware unused, and the chairs pushed neatly under the table. Everything was pristine, but the room had a strange, lifeless quality to it, like it hadn't seen a real meal in decades. I set the food down on a small side table near the door, eager to get out of there. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, there was a door. It was small, barely noticeable, and locked with a heavy iron padlock. The kind of door you wouldn't think twice about if it weren't for the way it seemed to stand out in the otherwise pristine room. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. Something about that door. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. The more I looked at it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden behind it. Something that was never meant to be found. "You shouldn't be here." The man's voice cut through my thoughts, startling me. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on the door at the far end of the room. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of fear in his expression, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Sorry," I mumbled, feeling suddenly foolish. "It's time for you to go," he said, cutting me off. His tone was firm and his gaze was hard. I nodded quickly and made my way toward the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I breathed a sigh of relief. But just as I reached my car, I glanced back at the mansion. The man was standing in the doorway watching me, and behind him I could just make out the faint outline of the locked door. That should have been the end of it. But for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. As I drove away, my mind kept drifting back to the way it had looked, so out of place in that grand, immaculate house. And the way the man had reacted, it was like he was guarding something he didn't want anyone to see. The next day, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. It was just a weird customer, I told myself. Weird house, weird guy, weird door. Nothing more. But as the day went on, I found myself thinking about it more and more. The curiosity gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing hour. By the time my shift ended that night, I had made up my mind. I was going back to that house. I didn't know why, and I knew it was probably a terrible idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what was behind that door. I waited until after dark, when the streets were quiet and the neighborhood was asleep. Then I drove back to Bramblewood Lane, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I pulled up to the gate. The mansion was just as imposing as it had been the night before, but this time it felt even darker. The shadows seemed to stretch further, the air thicker. The gate was open, just like it had been before, as if it had been waiting for me. I parked the car at the end of the driveway and made my way up to the front door. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The house was deathly silent. No lights, no movement, just the faint creaking of the old floorboards under my feet as I made my way to the dining room. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the locked door at the far end of the room. To my surprise, the padlock was gone. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. I hesitated for a moment, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But the curiosity was too strong. I had to know. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small and cramped, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. My flashlight flickered as I swept the beam across the room, revealing rows of shelves lined with dolls. Dozens of them. Their lifeless eyes stared back at me, their porcelain faces cracked and faded with age. At the center of the room there was a table, and on the table there was something covered with a sheet. My heart raced as I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. I reached out with trembling hands and pulled the sheet away. Underneath was a body. It was the man from the night before. His eyes were wide open, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. But it wasn't just his face that scared me. It was the fact that his skin had the same pale, lifeless quality as the dolls surrounding him. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting in horror. That's when I heard it, the soft creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned, and standing in the doorway was the man from the night before, or something that looked like him. But it wasn't him. It was pale, gaunt, and its eyes were dark, empty voids. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I bolted from the room, sprinting through the dining room and out the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and tore out of there, the mansion growing smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Bramblewood Lane after that. I didn't care about the money, the curiosity, or the unanswered questions. Whatever was in that house, whatever was behind that locked door, it was something that should never be found.
The Vanishing House. There are some places that just don't seem to belong. They stick out like a sore thumb, as if they were never meant to be there in the first place. The house on Vesper Lane was one of those places, and after that night, I realized that some places are better left alone. I'd been working late shifts as a delivery driver for about 6 months. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me enough flexibility to work on my side hustle during the day. Most of my shifts were the same routine: order, drive, deliver, repeat. But once in a while, something would come up that broke the monotony. That night was one of those nights. It was close to midnight, and I was ready to call it quits. I'd been driving around the city for hours, my back aching from being hunched over the wheel, my eyes burning from staring at streetlights and taillights for too long. I was halfway through my last delivery when my phone buzzed with a new order. I glanced at the screen, frowning at the address. 12 Vesper Lane. Vesper Lane wasn't a place I'd delivered to before. In fact, I didn't even recognize the street name, and I thought I knew the city pretty well. Still, the tip was decent, and it wasn't too far out of the way. I figured I could make one more stop before heading home. The GPS guided me through the quiet streets, the neighborhoods becoming more unfamiliar as I drove further from the city center. The streetlights thinned out, and the houses became sparser, each one sitting further back from the road, shrouded in shadows. The air felt different here, heavier, like it was weighed down with something unseen. As I turned onto Vesper Lane, a chill crept up my spine. The street was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, with towering trees on either side that blocked out the sky. The branches hung low, casting strange, shifting shadows across the road. It felt like I was driving into a tunnel, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt. Finally, my GPS chimed. You have arrived at your destination. I slowed the car, scanning the street for the house number. But something was off. There were no house numbers, no mailboxes, no signs of any houses at all. Just more trees, more shadows. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating only the narrow strip of road ahead. I double-checked the address on my phone. 12 Vesper Lane. This was it. But there was no house. I pulled over to the side of the road, staring out into the darkness, feeling a growing sense of unease. Maybe the house was set back from the road, hidden behind the trees. I grabbed the delivery bag, stepped out of the car, and started walking. The gravel crunched under my feet as I made my way down the road, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The air was colder than it had been a few minutes ago, and I could feel the chill settling into my bones. My flashlight flickered weakly as I swept it across the trees, searching for any sign of a driveway or a house. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. There, at the very edge of my flashlight's beam, stood a house. It was tall, narrow, and old, far older than any of the other houses in the neighborhood. The paint was peeling, the windows dark, and the front porch sagged as if it hadn't been maintained in years. But it was there, unmistakable, standing silently in the shadows, like it had been waiting for me. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the house felt wrong, like it didn't belong. But I was here, and I had a delivery to make. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the better of me. I walked up the overgrown path to the front door, my footsteps eerily loud in the stillness. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, and I raised my hand to knock on the door. But before I could knock, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark hallway beyond. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too small in the oppressive silence. No answer. I hesitated, peering into the darkness. The hallway stretched deep into the house, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through a window somewhere in the distance. I stepped inside, the old wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The house smelled of dust and decay, like it hadn't been lived in for years. But the lights were on. Faint, dim lights that cast long, unnatural shadows on the walls. As I walked further in, I noticed that the walls were lined with old portraits. Paintings of people who looked as though they had stepped out of a different time. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, their expressions cold and distant. I set the delivery bag down on a small table near the door, eager to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I heard something. A faint creaking sound, like the floorboards groaning under the weight of someone walking. My heart skipped a beat. Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. Again, no answer, just the sound of the house settling around me. But the feeling that I wasn't alone was growing stronger by the second. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I needed to leave. Now. I turned and made my way back toward the front door, my steps hurried. But when I reached the door, it was closed. I hadn't heard it close behind me, but there it was, shut tight, as if it had never been open in the first place. I grabbed the handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in as I pulled harder, but the door remained firmly shut. Come on, come on," I muttered under my breath, frantically trying to get the door open. And then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they were louder, closer. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. At the far end of the hallway, something was moving. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, slowly making its way toward me. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it move, its steps slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to find another way out. I turned and ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The house seemed to stretch on forever, the rooms blurring together as I ran from door to door, trying to find an exit. But every door I tried was locked. No matter where I went, I couldn't find a way out. The house was a maze, and I was trapped inside it. And all the while, I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. Finally, I stumbled into a room at the far end of the house, a small, dusty parlor filled with old furniture and more of those unsettling portraits. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, there was silence. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the room. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of the footsteps. But all I could hear was the creaking of the house around me. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound of the footsteps to return. But they never did. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the doorknob and opened the door a crack, peering out into the hallway. The hallway was empty. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been following me had gone. But just as I was about to step back into the hallway, something caught my eye. The hallway had changed. It wasn't the same dark, narrow hallway I had run down earlier. The walls were different, older, more decayed. The portraits were gone, replaced by long strips of peeling wallpaper. The floorboards were warped, cracked, and the air smelled of mold and rot. I stepped out of the room, my heart racing as I looked around. The entire house had changed. It wasn't the same place I had entered. It was like I had stepped into a different version of it, one that had been abandoned and left to rot for years. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps hesitant, my mind reeling. The rooms were different now too. The furniture was covered in dust, the windows boarded up, and the lights, those dim, flickering lights, were gone, leaving only darkness in their place. I had to get out of here, but every time I tried a door, it was locked. The house was shifting, changing around me, trapping me inside. And then I saw it, the front door. It was open, just a crack, the cool night air seeping in through the gap. My heart leapt with hope, and I sprinted toward it, not caring about the noise I was making. But just as I reached the door, something slammed it shut. I froze, my hand inches from the doorknob. Slowly, I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. Standing in the hallway was the shadowy figure. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow, it was a man. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his clothes were tattered, hanging loosely from his thin frame. He took a step toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't mean to. I was just making a delivery." His smile widened, and he took another step forward. "This place, it's not for you." I turned and yanked on the door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed shut, trapping me inside. The man was getting closer now, his hollow eyes locked on mine. "Once you enter, you can't leave." I slammed my fist against the door, panic rising in my chest. "Let me out! Let me out!" But it was no use. The house had me now.
The final delivery. The night was colder than usual for early autumn, the kind of cold that crept into your bones, making every breath sting a little as it left your lungs. I had been driving deliveries all day, trying to squeeze in as many orders as I could before calling it a night. The plan was to go home, shower, and crash in front of the TV with a beer. But, as usual, plans don't always work out the way you expect. I was about to finish my last order when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen. "Urgent delivery request, 72 Willoughby Road." I frowned. I didn't recognize the address, but then again, there were plenty of places in the city I'd never been. It was late and I was tempted to ignore it, but the promised tip was generous, really generous, enough to make me reconsider calling it a night. I sighed, plugged the address into my GPS and headed out. The drive took me toward the outskirts of the city, down roads I didn't know. The houses grew older, more spread out, the neighborhoods quieter. There were fewer street lights, and the trees along the roadside seemed taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Willoughby Road was one of those streets that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I almost missed the turn, but my GPS corrected me, the voice urging me to take the sharp left. The road was narrow, lined with old crumbling houses that looked abandoned. Each one stood far apart, their windows dark, their yards overgrown. The place had an eerie, forgotten feel to it, like a neighborhood that time had left behind. When I finally pulled up in front of 72 Willoughby Road, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The house was massive, an old Victorian mansion, its dark windows staring out like empty eyes. The front yard was a tangled mess of weeds and dead grass, and the porch looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. I parked the car and stared at the house for a moment, debating whether I should just turn around and leave. Something about the place felt wrong, but the money, well, the money was good, and I wasn't about to pass up a tip like that. Besides, I'd done plenty of late-night deliveries to strange houses before. What was one more? I grabbed the delivery bag and made my way up the cracked stone path to the front door. The wood of the door was warped and old, but there was a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. I hesitated for a second before lifting the knocker and giving it 3 solid raps. The sound echoed through the stillness, louder than it should have been. I waited, the silence stretching on for longer than was comfortable. Just as I was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked slightly outdated, like something from another era. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were cold, empty, like there was nothing behind them. His lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Delivery?" I said, holding up the bag. "Yes," he replied, his voice soft and low. "Come inside." I hesitated. Normally, I would just hand over the food and leave, but there was something about the way he was looking at me that made me uneasy. Still, I stepped across the threshold, the air inside colder than it had been outside. The door shut behind me with a soft click, and the man gestured for me to follow him. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls lined with old portraits and dusty, ornate mirrors. The light was dim, casting long shadows that seemed to move as we passed. The man led me deeper into the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The portraits on the walls, those faces, they all seemed familiar. We reached a large sitting room at the end of the hall, where a fire burned weakly in a stone fireplace. The room was furnished with antique chairs and a long, polished table. The man gestured for me to set the delivery down on the table, and I did, eager to leave. But as I turned to go, something caught my eye. There, hanging above the fireplace, was a large framed photograph. My stomach twisted as I stared at it. The photograph was old, faded, but the faces in it were unmistakable. It was a group of people all dressed in delivery uniforms, my uniform, and I recognized some of them. Tommy, Steve, Danielle. They had all worked at the same place I did. I hadn't seen them in months, maybe even a year. Each of them had disappeared without a trace, without so much as a word of where they had gone. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "They all came here, just like you." My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, my hands shaking. "I need to go." But the man moved faster than I expected. He stepped in front of me, his pale hand reaching out to grip my arm. His touch was icy cold, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "You're not leaving," he whispered, his grip tightening. "You're already part of this place now." I yanked my arm free, adrenaline surging through me, and bolted for the door. But the hallway, it wasn't the same. It twisted and shifted before my eyes, the walls narrowing, the portraits changing, the faces in the frames. They were watching me, their eyes following my every move, and the faces, they weren't just strangers anymore. I saw my co-workers, Tommy, Steve, Danielle, and me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out. I turned and ran down another hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The house seemed to stretch on forever, every corner leading to more dark, endless corridors. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate footsteps. The man was following me, but he wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. The house was on his side. I could feel it, the way the walls seemed to close in, the way the doors stayed locked no matter how hard I tried to open them. Panic surged through me as I ran, my lungs burning from the effort. Every door I tried was locked, every window barred. It was like the house was alive, trapping me inside its endless maze. Finally, I reached a stairwell. I sprinted up the stairs, 2 at a time, my mind racing. Maybe there was an attic, a window I could break open, some way out. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized I wasn't alone. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a figure, a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She was dressed in a delivery uniform, Danielle's uniform. She turned to look at me, and for a moment, I thought she was going to speak. But then her face twisted into a look of horror, and she disappeared into the shadows. "Danielle!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. But there was no answer, just the sound of the man's footsteps, still following me, still getting closer. I turned and ran again, my mind spinning. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know how to escape. The house seemed to shift around me, twisting and warping, leading me deeper into its labyrinth. Finally, I stumbled into a large open room. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of me, older, younger, terrified. In the center of the room stood the man, his cold eyes fixed on me. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing in the space. "This is your final delivery." I backed away, my heart racing, my mind screaming for a way out. But there was no way out. The house had me now, just like it had Tommy, Steve, Danielle, and all the others. I turned and ran for the door, but it was locked. The man's footsteps grew closer, his cold, dead eyes boring into me as I pounded on the door, screaming for help. But no one could hear me. No one ever would. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the truth. I wasn't just trapped in the house. I was part of it now.